Welcome to the NZIIA podcast. Here we talk all things international, from trade to geopolitics to diplomacy. The NZIIA seeks to encourage an understanding of the importance of global affairs to the political and economic well-being of New Zealand, as in this interconnected age, what happens beyond these shores affects us all at home. Hi guys, and welcome back to the NZIIA podcast. Today I'm joined in the studio by Patrick and Tanis, and we're going to be discussing Afghanistan. So this topic is particularly complicated and there's tons of content. So just a warning, there's going to be lots of names, dates, information flying past, but we'll try our best to make it interesting. So I'm going to lay out some history, which is really important for some context to what's going on right now. And then Tanis is going to take us through the current situation, and we're going to have an interesting discussion about some implications of everything. And then Patrick's going to take the lead on what's happening next. What can we predict to come out of this process of 100 years that started in 1921 when Britain first invaded Afghanistan? So it's been a 100-year-long journey, lots of lives and money and politics. So it's very, very significant to international relations, and that's why we're talking about it today. So we're not going to be able to talk about everything, but I'm going to try my best to give you the key dates and names of people which will give the correct context for what's going on and what's going to be happening later. So in 1953, the pro-Soviet general Muhammad Khan, who was the cousin of the king at the time, became prime minister. And the Soviets' premier aligned himself with this government and started to support it as a satellite nation. Now, this Muhammad Khan overthrew the last king in a military coup, and the USSR aligned themselves even further to help support this government that was largely seen as very, very weak. Now, in April 1978, the Afghanistani government, headed by Muhammad Khan, was overthrown by Nur Muhammad Taraki. This is when the Soviets rolled in to help support the government they had aligned themselves with before. And they did this on December 24th, 1979, and they rolled in 30,000 troops over the border. And then the Afghan war quickly settled down into a stalemate, with more than 100,000 Soviet troops controlling the cities, larger towns, and major garrisons. And while this was happening, the Mujahideen started to form in the rural areas of Afghanistan, but they were divided and were largely a response to a more conservative understanding of the government and an Islamic state for Afghanistan. That was their vision, and Mujahideen means those who engage in jihad. That's an important point for later. The Soviets attempted to eliminate the Mujahideen civilian support by bombing and depopulating the rural areas. These tactics sparked a massive flight from the countryside, and by 1982, 2.8 million Afghans had sought asylum in Pakistan, and 1.5 million had fled to Iran. The Mujahideen were eventually able to neutralize Soviet air power through the use of shoulder-fired anti-aircraft that were provided by their benefactors, the United States. The Mujahideen were fragmented politically into a handful of independent groups, and the military efforts were largely unorganized. While this was going on, in 1988, Osama bin Laden and 15 other Islamists formed the group Al-Qaeda, or the Base, to continue their jihad or holy war against the Soviets and others who they say oppose their goal of a pure nation governed by Islam. Their belief that Soviets' faltering war in Afghanistan was directly attributed to the Mujahideen and their jihad. They claimed victory in their first battle, but also begin to shift their focus to America, saying that the remaining superpower is the main obstacle in the establishment of a state based on Islam. Now, in total, the Soviets suffered around 15,000 dead and many more injured, and they failed to implement a sympathetic regime in Afghanistan, even though that was their goal. In 1988, the Soviet Union signed an accord with the United States, Pakistan, and Afghanistan and agreed to withdraw its troops. And in 1989, the US, Pakistani, Afghani-Soviet accords were signed in Geneva, but the Mujahideen continued their resistance against the Soviet-backed regime for a couple of years after this. Now, that gives basically the context up until the Afghanistan war, and this is the prelude to the September 11 attacks. In 1995, the newly formed Islamic militia, the Taliban, rises to power on promises of peace. Most Afghans who are exhausted by war at this point, through drought and famine, approve of the Taliban for upholding traditional Islamic values. The Taliban for outlaw cultivation of poppies for the opium trade, crack down on crime, and curtail the education and employment of women. The United States refuses to recognize the authority of the Taliban. The Taliban emerged in the 1996 seized Kabul and instituted a severe interpretation of Islamic law. That same year, Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden was welcomed to Afghanistan and established his organization's headquarters there. With all al-Qaeda's help, the Taliban won control over 90% of Afghan territory by summer of 2001. On September 9th of that year, al-Qaeda hitmen carried out the assassination of Mujahideen leader Ahmed Sah, who at the time was leading the Northern Alliance, which was a loose coalition of Mujahideen militias that maintained control of a small section of northern Afghanistan as it battled the Taliban, who had swiftly sought greater US backing for efforts. And now in 2000, Osama bin Laden is widely considered as an international terrorist, where he is cultivating thousands of followers in training camps in Afghanistan. The United States demands that bin Laden be extradited to stand trial for the embassy bombings that happened in the east coast of Africa a couple of years prior. The Taliban declined to extradite him, and the United States pushes Afghanistan with sanctions, restricting trade and economic development. And then what follows from this is the September 11 attacks, where jetliners were crashed into the World Trade Center buildings and some other attacks around Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C. Bush demanded that the Taliban leader, Mullah Muhammad Ahmad, deliver to the United States authorities all the leaders of al-Qaeda who hide in your land. Omar refused, and the US officials began implementing a plan for war. And so I'll open it up here for you guys to weigh in. So as you guys can see, there's been a lot of back and forth with the regimes, people coming in and out of power, and now we're sitting on the precipice of America entering into Afghanistan.
I think it's just quite interesting, especially how a lot of the regime changes are kind of sparked by international interference. You had Russia interfering at the beginning, and then we've also had the US interfering now. The Taliban taking control, I'm not too aware of who their biggest funders are. I'm pretty sure quite a bit of it is self-funded through natural resources, and especially opium trading is very big. But it's quite interesting to see that this is probably one of the first times where a regime change has happened without external interference. The US withdrew. That's the first time, forces withdrawn, and then they've just taken it over from now.
Yeah, the regime changes have always been interesting in Afghanistan because, as you said, they have been largely dictated by foreign national investment. So the Mujahideen, the Northern Alliance, all the key political factors in Afghanistan have always had foreign backing, whether it's US, Russia, other Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia. They've all had this external pressure, but external presumptions made about their objectives, their goals. And often when you are funded by a foreign government, you do begin to see a shift in the direction of your policies and in the actions you take. This, again, is seen most clearly with Osama bin Laden.
And so following up on that, this is the US campaign in Afghanistan officially started on September 26, where the CIA led a team known as Jawbreaker to start promoting to the Northern Alliance and start pulling in resources for Afghani forces to then fight the Taliban inside Afghanistan. And so the US officials hoped that by partnering with the Afghans, they could avoid deploying a large force to Afghanistan. So this is directly after the attacks. They were not interested in going in themselves. The United States relied primarily on the Northern Alliance, as you alluded to, Patrick, which had just lost Mossad, but had regrouped under other commanders, including Tajik, Mohammad Fahim, and Abdul Rashid Dostum in Uzbek. The Americans also teamed with anti-Taliban Pashtuns in southern Afghanistan, including a little-known tribal leader named Hamid Karzai. Now, this name is important later, Hamid Karzai. And so the Afghanistan spiritual home, which was in Kandahar, was lost in December 6th of that same year, marking the end of Taliban power. It was besieged by a force led by Karzai that moved in from the north and one commanded by Gul Agha Sirazeri that advanced from the south. This was with heavy assistance from the United States. The Taliban leadership retreated into Afghanistan's rural areas and across the border into Pakistan. Anti-Taliban figures convened at a UN-sponsored conference in Bonn, Germany, that behind-the-scenes maneuvering by the United States, Karzai was selected to lead the country on an interim basis. Now, an intensive manhunt for bin Laden started, and al-Qaeda deputy chief Ahmed al-Zawahiri was undertaken. Prior to the killing of bin Laden by US forces in 2011, the Americans were believed to have come in close contact with bin Laden in that December 2001 battle at Tora Bara, which you might have heard of before. But bin Laden was thought to have managed to slip into Pakistan with the help of Afghan and Pakistani forces that were supposed to be helping the Americans. Critics later questioned why the US military had allowed Afghan forces to lead the assault on the cave complex rather than doing it themselves. Now, what followed the ouster of the Taliban and al-Qaeda? It started with the Afghan Marshall Plan, essentially. The foreign investment needed the US troops staying around to help rebuild after ousting the Taliban from Afghanistan. But between 2001 and 2009, just over $38 billion in humanitarian and reconstruction assistance was appropriated to Afghanistan. more than half the money went to training and equipping Afghan security forces. The aid program was also bedeviled by waste and by confusion over whether civilian or military authorities had responsibility for leading education, health, agriculture, and development projects. So it was very hard for the US military to nation build because the US military was used to dealing with security forces. And so all the money and resources that were flowing through the US military went to security forces, not essentially what we would describe as the people, the civilian, the public sector, who maybe had the expertise of how to distribute this and might have been less inclined for corruption.
I just want to point out that a good indictment of the failed thinking that was prevalent at this time was one of the core infrastructure ideas that the US had was to build a ring road system around Afghanistan, which sounds good, but their primary purpose for it was to be able to move troops around so they could move their troops and the Afghans' troops quickly with purpose around the kind of rural areas in Afghanistan. And that's where they focused a lot of their infrastructure build.
Just on that as well, we've stated military and their purpose in nation building. David Kilcullen has a really good interview talking about the successes of counterterrorism, and he especially talks about the fact that Western strategy has largely been military dominant in its thinking. When we go into a nation, you attack the opposition, and then you use the military to rebuild and build the state up from ground one. The way he puts it is, we are using the military to turn their conventional wartime successes into long-term political outcomes. Militaries aren't really good at this, as we can see throughout any example of US interference, especially in the Middle East. And it's a big error that Western powers are still using to this day. You can see it in cyber, and you can see it in space and other examples as well, where we're not including civilian and academic input into our thinking. And for example, Russia very much is doing that and is an example of how they're merging civilian and military together.
So initially the war appeared to have been one of relative ease, right? The Marshall Plan is being implemented, and on May the 1st, 2003, US Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld announced an end to the major combat in Afghanistan. So this is almost 18 years ago. And so the first democratic Afghan elections since the fall of the Taliban was held on October 9th, 2004, with 80% registered voters turning out to give Karzai a full 5-year term as president. So here's their name again, Karzai. The 2004 constitution provided Afghanistan with a powerful central government and weak regional and local authorities. But this structure, as Tanis alluded to, is a structure that was in opposition to the country's long-standing traditions and the way the civilian population liked to play out their politics of the nation for so many years prior. Now, despite the vast powers that the Western-backed government had, Karzai was widely regarded as a weak leader, and he grew isolated as the war progressed after 2004. And there were more problems that came up after this, which we'll get into. So the Taliban's resurgence corresponded with the rise in anti-American, anti-Western sentiment among the Afghans from this point. And in May 2006, a US military vehicle crashed and killed several Afghans, an event that sparked violent anti-American riots in Kabul, the worst since the war began. Later that year, NATO took command of the war across the country. American officials said that the United States would play a lesser role and that the war would become increasingly international. This shift reflected the greater need for US troops and resources in Iraq, where sectarian warfare was reaching alarming levels. By contrast, the war in Afghanistan was still regarded in Washington as a relative success at this point. And then we move to a couple more years of the same business as usual, trying to nation build, anti-American sentiment building up, and then we get to the Obama administration. So on February 17th, 2009, Obama approved sending an additional 17,000 troops on top of 36,000 US troops and 32,000 NATO service members already there. 3 months later, Obama took the rare step of removing a commanding general from the theatre of war, replacing General David McKernan with General Stanley McChrystal. While McKernan was shifting US strategy in Afghanistan, Obama and other top officials concluded that a more radical change was needed. And so essentially, the strategy involved trying to persuade enemy fighters to defect and ultimately encouraging a reconciliation between the Karzai government and the Taliban, because they realized that rooting out the Taliban was never going to work. So that was the next strategy that was tried. But ultimately, it was decided that this strategy would need more US involvement and troops to pull off. And so this is when you start to see the slow trickling of more and more US troops pouring into Afghanistan under the Obama administration. Meanwhile, Karzai announced that he would attempt to reconcile with the Taliban. He invited Mullah Omar to meet him, but the Taliban leader would refuse. And it got to such a point where Karzai lashed out to the United States in April 2010 and even threatened to join the Taliban if the international community to not stop meddling in the affairs of Afghanistan.
Just on your point there as well, when we talk about Obama's role in the Afghanistan crisis, and we always talk about putting X amount of troops in, and that is a kind of a current theme throughout US involvement and US war throughout history, is it's boots on the ground, and it's kind of a force mismatch where we think we can win this war by simply putting more people in there. We don't even think about what vehicles are going in to an extent, what equipment is being sent in, or where these people are being stationed and what they're doing. It's just, if we put 30,000 more troops in, surely this is going to come to a conclusion sooner. And it was Biden who was quite critical of that as well, and was always calling for, we need to be thinking more than this.
Yeah. And then, so again, we're skipping over some important things. There's another general change, but we're just going to keep it rolling. So a series of incidents in early 2012 heightened tensions between the US and Afghan government and provoked public outrage. So this was when the video of the US Marines urinating on dead Afghans circulated in the media. This was a PR nightmare for everybody. It sparked massive riots in Kabul again. And then on March 11th, a US soldier allegedly left an American base near Pinjwai and broke into several homes, shooting dead 17 Afghans, mostly women and children. So this incident provoked widespread demonstrations and a sharp condemnation from Karzai. Days later, the Taliban suspended participation in talks with the United States and the Afghan government. So this again was the military curtailing any sort of talks between the Karzai government and the Taliban. And we kind of move forward to 2014, where the issue of foreign troops in Afghanistan was not solved 4 years later. And Karzai, in the last couple of months of his presidency, had refused to sign the bilateral security agreement before leaving office. And the election of the successor was delayed by a lengthy recount. So this again pushed back any sort of negotiations another couple of years. And so we see that the US and NATO formally ended their combat mission in Afghanistan on December 28, 2014, so 7 years ago, but retained a reduced force of approximately 13,000 troops to support and train Afghan troops. And then we see the slow withdrawal of US troops, and then February 2019, US and Taliban signed agreement on peace deal that would serve as the preliminary terms for the US withdrawal by the country by May 2021. Then you have the Trump presidency, where the peace talks are called off as a US soldier is killed in a Taliban attack. November 2020, US announces plans to cut US troop size in half. April 2021, Biden announces the aim to withdraw troops completely. And then July 5th, 2021, US leaves Bagram airfield without telling the base's new Afghan commander. This is when the real withdrawal starts to ramp up. August 10th, 2021, White House says Taliban takeover is not inevitable. August 15th, 2021, Afghan government collapses and the Taliban take over Kabul 5 days later. And this is the last thing on this context. August 26th, 2021, 2 suicide bombings occur outside Kabul airport as thousands of Afghans try to flee the country following the Taliban's takeover. The bombings killed at least 169 Afghans and 13 US troops. The extremist group ISIS-K, the affiliate of the terror group ISIS, which uses the K to reference an old name for Afghanistan, Khorasan, claim responsibility for the explosions. And in a speech from the White House that evening, President Joe Biden does not reverse course, and on August 31, withdrawal date is still the plan. He vows to retaliate against the perpetrators of the attack, saying, "We will not forgive, we will not forget." And then August 30th, the US transports a final contingent of troops from Kabul airport, officially ending America's longest war. So that's a lot of information and dates, but that is a brief overview of the history. There's a lot more detail, so I would encourage anyone to read up on anything we said. There's a lot of context there we could not include, but that is the situation we're left with. We will probably move into what's going on next. But what do you guys think of all that?
No, I think it's really interesting. You did a very good job catching it up, and it is hard to summarize so much that happened because you've got so many international actors that are involved and are all shifting things around, new leaders popping up constantly.
One thing that I think should be made clear with the US withdrawal was that it was an agreement made between the Trump administration and the Taliban that they would be withdrawn by a certain date. A keynote on the withdrawal that needs to be addressed is the Trump administration's involvement in brokering, for lack of a better word, an agreement with the Taliban in a safe withdrawal of US troops. One of those, and likely the reason Biden has so rigidly stuck to the pullout date when it comes to pulling out troops and civilians and US involvement, is the mass retaliation that the Taliban threatened should US involvement not end by that date.
So we're now left with this current situation in Afghanistan that obviously that context was up to August 31st. We're now at the end of September. So, Tanis, could you take us through just what are the key things going on in that moment, since obviously lots of people listening will probably have had their last major input of information when the Kabul crisis was going on. So what's been going on since then?
I'll just give the headlines of stuff that I'll talk about, and then I'll go into them a little bit more further. Firstly, Afghanistan is going through a really severe famine at the moment. It's something that has been a reoccurring plague for the country for most of its history. We'll talk a little bit about ISIS-K, what's the differences between it and the Taliban, what is its attacking force size, its leadership, and what it aims to achieve. We can talk about some of the policies that the Taliban has introduced and their internal structure. However, I do need to stipulate that it's still highly unobservable, their internal structure at the moment. And even searching up some of their main ministers, you can't find photos of them out and about. It's not readily accessible. We'll also have a quick talk about international representatives. States are going to have to view the Taliban government as legitimate, and therefore, are they going to be a part of international institutions? And then we're going to conclude with the refugee and migration crisis that is going to occur from this. But before we get into that stuff, I just quite quickly like to talk about the Afghan military and some misconceptions around why they fell so quickly. It's widely known that the Afghan military was about 300,000 strong. That's more than quite a lot of NATO member nations' military themselves. They're trained by the US. They've got US equipment. How did a force of 300,000 fall to the Taliban, who were a fraction of that? And there's a few things that I'd like to talk about in that. Number one is famine. We've just mentioned that before, but towards the end of the American withdrawal, a lot of these Afghan soldiers were just eating potatoes as rations. That's all they had left. And that led to a drastic decline in morale, especially when your trainers and your supervisors and people that have been defending you and training you to be able to defend Afghanistan have almost on a dime pulled out. And that's especially from your perspective when you don't know the behind-the-scenes negotiations. And especially as you talked about before, the US was not completely clear with the Afghan government and the Afghan military that we're pulling ex-troops from this base, we're pulling ex-troops from this base. Many Afghan soldiers woke up to find the US military was gone. The equipment was gone, everything was gone, no one was to be seen. That, in culmination with the famine and some other factors, was a massive decline to morale. And especially since the Taliban's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Amir Khan, was responsible with negotiating with a lot of the Afghan military and police and talking them down and being able to settle things peacefully. And that's how, his role in negotiation really eased the transition of power for the Taliban. So we'll talk a little bit about the famine now. So about 14 million people, including 2 million children, are food insecure in Afghanistan. So that's about 1 in 3 people in the country are at risk. That is been a historic reoccurring thing, like I've said, and has mainly been solved by international aid. On that point, it's very interesting to see that a lot of warlords and a lot of figures in Taliban politics, especially in tribal and rural areas, have gained a lot of their power from this. Where aid has been dropped into a region, warlords have moved in, taken the aid and used it as bartering and used it as power amongst the local populace, where they've gone, you can have this food, but you need to pay taxes and you need to see us as legitimate. And it's going to be interesting to see if history will repeat itself when inevitably foreign nations are going to be putting aid into Afghanistan, because you can't, from an international perspective, let millions of people starve, whether the Taliban is going to use that to win over some of the areas that are still holding back. Another interesting thing that I found was food prices were just skyrocketing throughout the place. And when the American withdrawal was happening, a bottle of water in a Kabul airport cost $40. That's how crazy food prices and water prices was there. And just showing how destabilizing that is on the economy, 75% of government funding of the Afghani government was from international support. That sudden withdrawal, you can't fund anything. And on that point, it's going to be very interesting to see how the Taliban form the new regime and actually how they're going to be paying for things, because we've not seen that yet. And we probably won't see that for a little while as things get ironed out and things get put in place. So that's it on the famine. I know for certain China has promised about $31 million in aid. I believe the US is picking up $6 billion to chuck towards aid and help migration as well. So now we'll talk a little bit about ISIS-K. So ISIS-K has claimed about 3 attacks in the last few weeks or so, probably more. And the big one was the airport, the Kabul airport. So the ISIS-K and the Taliban began fighting in 2015 when they were at their peak at about 6,000 fighters. However, this has fallen to some current estimates of 500 to 1,500, although I would want to stipulate that Western security intelligence has not been particularly good at guessing how strong a fighting force is. You've got to take that with a heavy grain of salt. But a recent UN report pointed out that they have the capacity and the equipment to support about 10,000 fighters if people started moving more towards them. So what makes the ISIS-K and Taliban very different? Both the Taliban and ISIS-K want to implement Sharia law and use Islam as the code of law and ethics. But the Taliban are more focused on keeping that within Afghanistan, controlling Afghanistan itself, whereas ISIS-K is part of a global initiative to kind of create a caucus of Islamic states. It will be quite interesting to see how the Taliban deals with ISIS-K, especially because many of the ISIS-K members are former Taliban soldiers that have been disenfranchised with the Taliban's many defeats against the US and its allies. So it will be interesting to see whether the Taliban can successfully navigate the famine, which is going to be a massive crisis that they're going to have to deal with. Their dealing with the famine will really determine if ISIS-K gets more support. And if ISIS-K get more support, that's going to be another opposition that the Taliban are going to have to fight. And that's going to be, again, another internal and civil fight that's going to be going on. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Taliban's policies that they have proposed. So on free speech, they've been kind of wish-washy. When they first got into power, they announced that their freedom of the press will be allowed to keep leaders to better account and that women are allowed to hold journalist positions. However, as I will state throughout some of these more policies, they've said a lot of things and gone back on them immediately. So you can't take it as fact at this point. They're still structuring their internal system. They've declared that they're going to be exploiting their natural resources to heal the country. And that's going to be especially interesting because as of recently, I think it was the day after US withdrawal, they found $1 trillion worth of lithium, which is used for most electronics. That on top of, I think they're the biggest exporters of opium in the world and other natural resources. There's going to be a lot of international actors that are going to want in on that, especially because that will now be state controlled most likely. And states like China and Russia are probably going to want to jump in on this, especially because the Taliban are historically very anti-US. On culture and entertainment, I believe it was music and other forms of entertainment were highly frowned upon and sometimes outright banned under the Taliban's regime in the 90s. They've said that they're not going to ban it outright now, but that they will try and incentivize individuals not to listen to music, especially Western entertainment. But again, time will tell how that plays out. For education, it was actually quite interesting. It was either today or a couple of days ago, the University of Kabul banned any woman from entering the university. And that is still going on. So although they initially said that women would be allowed to seek education, they're not anymore. And moreover, with teaching, I believe it's males that are over 6, women aren't allowed to teach. So you've kind of got a lot of women in Afghanistan are now out of the job. They're really unsure of what positions they're actually going to be hold, especially because things are changing daily. Law and order, executions and dismemberment, for example, thieves will have their hands cut off or foot cut off. They will be reintroduced, although they've said that this time it's not going to be public or televised, which under their last was. That to me is quite interesting because it means that, from my perspective at least, the Taliban recognize that if they do things publicly, they're going to garner a lot of international attention, and attention they probably don't want. They just took power. They probably want things to calm down a little and set everything up. So I think it's going to be interesting because it might be quiet for a little while everything gets set up, and then we might see a ramping up of their law and order policies. On international representatives, I believe the UN are holding a conference very soon, or it's going on now. So I'll conclude now with the refugee and migration crisis. So as of, I believe it was 2020, there were 2.8 million displaced Afghanistans worldwide, with about 3 million internally displaced. And this is only going to surge dramatically. I mean, this was from 2020. This is not including statistics that are coming out now. New Zealand, for example, has taken on 370 refugees that were in New Zealand-related positions, I believe, or representative positions. Biden has announced that they're raising the cap to 125,000 people as of next year, but that's not now. And that leaves a lot of refugees in this feeling of limbo. A lot of them are in military bases around the Asia-Pacific region. A lot of them are stuck in Europe and other places waiting for transfer to other countries. And that's only going to escalate. And refugee camps are notoriously ill-funded and have horrific conditions. If funding is not diverted to these, we're just going to see a total collapse of a lot of them. And especially as a common criticism of refugee camps, it's often a worse place than refugees leave from when they get there. A lot of them are quite horrific. And as of a couple of days ago, the US House of Reps passed $6.3 billion in aid funding. That will include refugee quotas. That will also include food transportation. On a side note, something interesting that happened recently with Turkey and the US relationship. Turkey historically has played a balancing act with the US and Russia, but recently they've started leaning more towards Russia, as Turkey is the gateway to Europe for a lot of Middle Eastern migrants and refugees. It's going to be really interesting how they react to this potentially massive influx of Afghan refugees that are fleeing in fear of prosecution by the new Taliban government.
So now I'm going to cover the what comes next section of this podcast. So I'm going to go through very briefly the politics. Tanis has already covered that quite extensively. We'll then go on to the Taliban and their relationship with the Western powers, how China is actively engaging in this evolving situation. And then to bring it all back, I want to touch on the civilian life and how that's likely to change, how it has changed, some ways for the better and others for the much worse. So the primary focus of this politics section is going to cover the recognition of the Taliban by the Western liberal governments and how Taliban leaders and Western nations have been engaging in this. The Taliban have undoubtedly formed a government, and this has led to a platform of engagement which Western nations haven't had or possibly hadn't wanted before. So when we talk about Taliban and Western powers, the key note of this is the Taliban's evolving relationship with the US. Recently, a US drone was spotted over Taliban-occupied territory, and what the Taliban openly said is that it was a breach of Afghan airspace and has since accused the US of violating the withdrawal agreements. As mentioned earlier, the withdrawal agreements is very important because of the threats that the Taliban had should the US not be out, and the US is very cautious of breaching these agreements. This means that since the Taliban regained power, the US has generally pursued a policy of tentative engagement and actual cooperation. However, again, they have not officially recognized the government. This recognition ultimately accumulated in the UN General Assembly, where the Afghanistan representative was removed from the list of speakers in the UN General Assembly. The country announced its formal withdrawal, but did not state why. The Taliban followed up this request to withdrawal with a request of their own promoting their own representative, but this was turned down by the UN, citing UN protocol and the fact the Afghanistan mission, which is the representation of Afghanistan in the UN, hadn't formalized that request. This is going to be an ongoing issue in the UN and wider international community for a while, especially considering that a number of Afghan officials have set up a government in exile. Taking advantage or potentially taking advantage of this is China. China has historically been more than willing to cooperate with authoritarian-style governments and unlikely to change their stance with the Taliban. In fact, China was one of the first to recognize the government and have actively engaged with the Taliban, citing them as a potential ally. However, although China says it's got a good relationship, the rhetoric that they are putting forward to the global audience is marred with some issues. The China-Taliban relationship is primarily marred by the ongoing Uyghur crisis in northern China, in Xinjiang. This has led to many tensions of unease, as although China would rather build a relationship and protect themselves from terror attacks, the ongoing issues of the Muslims in China has become a hot-button issue already between the Taliban. However, when we are addressing China and the Taliban, China has outwardly spoken about the relationship in an attempt to try and build, knowing that they are potential targets for terrorist activities. An ongoing consideration for many in the foreign policy is they want to engage in economic politics with the Taliban to ensure that their security and their civilian lives are not harmed by potential terror attacks. This will be interesting as we have talked about ISIS-K and the Taliban and ongoing threats there. It's going to be interesting to see who China decides to cooperate with and to what extent, but there is ongoing developments around this. Having considered all of this international politics and domestic policy, ultimately it comes back to how civilian life is going to change. Since the Taliban takeover, Afghanistan's countryside has seen a big drop in violence after the 20 years of fighting. Quotes come out such as, "It's been a long time now since a bullet hit our homes." This is accumulated with the low number of roadblocks, the mass reduction in random killings. As Tanis has mentioned, the new Taliban law and order has been actually proactive, although it is extreme retaliation for crimes. The ultimate threat of the crimes has seen a reduction in crime rates in many rural communities. This has accumulated in a low number of random killings that were prevalent throughout the war. Hospitals have been told largely that they can run as normal, although, as we've talked about, things are changing day by day. Although the countryside may have some resemblance of peace, it is in the cities which, although once were used as a way for the Taliban to present themselves as a more progressive and more enlightened government to the wider world through the use of media, this has again now completely changed and they've gone back on a lot of their words. Female employees in Kabul city government have been told to stay home. They are only allowed to work in work which cannot be replaced by men, and the Taliban have said that they will later detail further restrictions for women. In recent days, as mentioned, the Taliban government has issued several decrees rolling back the rights of girls and women. It has told female middle and high school students that they could not return to school for the time being, while boys in those grades simply resume study. This, as mentioned before, accumulated in the universities, where university students were informed that although some may be able to return, it would be in segregated sections and that they must abide by the Islamic dress code. Ultimately, the policy and human side of this ongoing crisis is hard to get out, with a lot of journalists and a lot of media sources being restricted in where and where they can't go.
So I think what we'll do is we'll just end the discussion on essentially what a coulda, shoulda discussion, because recently Brown University put out a study regarding what was the overall cost of everything since 2001. So this is not including all the historical strife that the Afghani people have had to be subject to. This is only after the attacks and US involvement in 2001. Now, the main points of the study is essentially the total cost of the war on the American taxpayer is suggested to be about $8 trillion. And this $8 trillion number is very highly politicized in the US, and it must be taken with a grain of salt. But the general breakdown of it is that there has been $6.4 trillion essentially that have come through the Pentagon directly related to counterterrorism and the intervention wars that include Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and Yemen. Now, the extra $2 trillion comes from the federal government that will need to get pumped through to basically wrap up the wars in total. So this includes things like money going towards veteran affairs to look after people, pay people's pensions, pay soldiers, and to essentially wrap up this project. Now, on top of this, thousands of US service members have died, hundreds of thousands of civilians have died. In total, they're thinking about 900,000 just since 2001. So almost 1 million people have died. More civilians have died than troops have died. And in an address to the nation on August 31st, President Joe Biden cited cost of war estimates to convey the financial and human burden 20 years later as well. So even though we're talking about this situation now, all these costs are going to keep piling up for another 20 years. And as we've alluded to, the fighting in Afghanistan is far from over. But Joe Biden also pointed out there was no clear purpose to being in Afghanistan anymore, which is quite a thing to say considering these costs. So I wanted you guys to weigh in on the cost, there being no mission left, what was achieved, and how will international relations in the world never be the same thanks to the September 11 attacks and US's choice of response.
So I think Joe Biden's statement with the withdrawal that it had to happen at some point, and now with no mission, with no purpose to remain, now was the best time possible. Because no matter when the withdrawal happened, these horrible results were always going to happen with a US withdrawal. The US Army knew that the Taliban would eventually take over. It was only a matter of time. Again, they didn't predict it would be a matter of days, but they did only predict a matter of months. So these are the things that have played into the US psyche when it comes to that. You have to remember that the support for the war domestically is at an all-time low in the US, although reasonable international pressures and very reasonable moralistic reasons for pulling out of the war, domestic pressure was a significant factor.
And adding on the flip side of that coin, so you're talking about withdrawal, but let's think about entering, right? Is that public perception to enter and the call for blood and for revenge after 9/11 was real, right? People were protesting in the streets against people protesting against the war. And that's the reality of the situation that I think people ignore, is that in 2001, the US wanted revenge. And the reality of the situation is there were lots of non-military alternatives to holding accountable those responsible for 9/11. But under that domestic pressure you're talking about, Patrick, or approval ratings and an opportunity, you could say, if we're talking a real pessimistic view, this was the choice that led us on a 20-year path as an international community. And as we've discussed, the very morbid results of this strategy. But I think it is important to note, as you're saying about the public perception to withdrawal has been strong, but in 2001, I think the theme of the day was revenge, and that it was almost given no choice to go in there in many respects because of that call for blood was real. And I think many people who say, why weren't non-military means pursued, I think forget what the climate was like in 2001. I don't think there was any way the US was not going to respond in the way they did as the sole superpower who saw a new threat to tackle and address.
Just on that, talking about approval rating and just talking about the sheer kind of psyche, especially within the US, President Bush is often looked back on as not a great presidency. But at that time, he's held one of the highest approval ratings, between 80 and 90% approval rating right after 9/11. And if we can just talk about how President Trump, abysmal approval rating pretty much throughout, Biden's doing okay, but imagine a president getting 90 approval percent rating today is kind of unimaginable, but Bush did it.
Exactly. And so we've kind of gone on this journey where we've given the historical context, the truly decade-long struggle that the Afghani people have had to be subject to, and then the crisis now and the perspectives of pulling out, staying in, the perceptions and the famine, displacement, civilian casualties cost financially to people. And we're kind of left in a situation where we think, whether you zoom out and think about the whole thing in an IR theoretical conceptual manner, or if you think about the millions of families who have lost loved ones or have been forced to leave their homes or have lost rights, it's impossible to really fathom the impact this has had and on how many people and in how many walks of life. And I think we're going to wrap it up soon, but something to think about as well is that did the attacks on 9/11 really crumble with the US's position in the world forever, which was Osama bin Laden's main goal, was to show the US to be a superpower which was imperialistic like the Soviet Union, was not morally correct to be leading the world. And I think it would be fair to say that the internal strife and the cost of war and the massive cost to the United States' international standings and the mistakes after mistakes after mistakes that have been made, I think a lot of those goals that Osama bin Laden set out have been achieved even after his death. And that's not a happy thought for anybody either, but it is seemingly the reality, right?
I think definitely so. And especially we're coming out of a 20-year war. And I highly doubt that the US will ever get enough approval rating to go back into one like that ever again. I mean, they were there for 20 years and just consistently bad strategy at handling radicalism Like, the US is proven to fight in conventional war. If there's a conventional war enemy, the US does really well. But they're really bad at preventing radicalism and re-educating, persuading people back over. And that's the weapon of terrorist and insurgent groups these days, is that...
So it's played right into their hands.
Yeah.
And then created how many more future Osama bin Ladens through their actions in trying to get one guy.
Exactly. And you look at the power of morale. The Afghan army, 300,000 strong, crumbled within, a couple days. And that's just due to the power of radicalism that the Taliban had. They were surging in recruitment. They didn't have high-tech weapons. If you looked at that as a case study, you'd go, oh, the Afghan military would surely win. If you looked at it on a purely numbers basis. But that's where we need to stop looking at stuff as numbers of military soldiers and tanks and conventional weapon systems and start looking at radicalism, public support as a big one.
I think ultimately, regardless of how you view Afghanistan and Osama's hand in ending that or prolonging it, and we're going to talk about the US here, but the biggest impact has been the psyche change in the world and how the globe has responded to these. The US is now arguably at one of its most fractured domestic politically place it's ever been. There's talks like the new Red Scare. There's already very strong Islamophobia. Right-wing groups are kind of somehow placing themselves in the Overton window. And these are very destabilizing things. So ultimately, it may not even be the terrorist attack. It may be the fact that the US has neglected its domestic issues for 20 years to go fight a war in foreign soil. And we've talked about the cost that it's going to take 20 years on from that war. But that's not even when you consider how badly veterans are treated by the US government, how there's housing crisis due to influx of people and people having to move towards city centres. These very serious domestic issues that have been overlooked for decades, with politicians riding on this war fever and the military-industrial complex having a stranglehold on the domestic politics of the US, is really all going to come to light right now. And it's going to be likely sad, but interesting to see how the US navigates this space, because already you see a lot of discontent directed for Biden for how the war ended. But most people wanted the war to end. It's unfortunate how it did, but as I said earlier, it was always likely going to end like this. There was never going to be a silver lining to this war. There was always going to be destruction following the US withdrawal, and it may be domestic, and that's what's the scariest thing.
The thing that's crazy is that there was always money to go and fight these groups in the mountains in Afghanistan and to try and stamp out terrorism by drone striking people and the constant mistakes the strategy had. But there was never any money for aid or curing hunger in these regions. And right now there's another mass starvation happening in Yemen. As the international community, I think it's been hard to watch the whole thing happen and to believe that this was ever about installing a democratic government or values or freedom or anything like that. It's a hard pill to swallow for everybody to see. At the end of the day, these people are just people. And I feel like in the pursuit of giving freedom and stability and, Western values to the Middle East, the US has inadvertently showed the world that these are not the values that are reflected in themselves and in a lot of the Western world either. And I feel like that's a sombering thought as we move into a highly stressful COVID time, and the ripple effects will be felt for decades. So I think we'll leave it there with those thoughts about what's going to happen next for Afghanistan. The issues are going to keep rolling on, and it'll be an interesting case study to watch. But thank you very much for tuning into the NZIIA podcast. Thank you to Tanis and Patrick for being here and co-hosting with me today.
You're welcome. Tireless research went into this, and I'm glad I'm appreciated.
Thank you for having us. It's a really important discussion to have, I think.
So anyway, guys, thanks so much for listening. You can check out all of our podcasts at NZIIAYP on Spotify, and check out our Instagram page for any updates at NZIIAYP. Cool, guys. Thanks for listening.